The chandeliers of Ashworth House blazed with 1,000 candles, their light catching the diamonds adorning the throats of London's finest ladies. The ballroom hummed with conversation, laughter, and the delicate strains of a waltz that seemed to float through the air like whispered secrets. Outside, snow fell in thick, lazy flakes, blanketing the city in white and turning the world beyond the tall windows into something resembling a dream. Inside, however, the air was warm with the press of bodies, the scent of expensive perfumes mingling with the spicy aroma of mulled wine and the fresh greenery that decorated every corner of the magnificent room. But for Adrian Blackwell, the Duke of Ravenshire, the evening felt like anything but a dream. It felt like a carefully choreographed performance in which he was merely playing a role, one he had perfected over the years with practiced ease. He moved through the crowd with the grace expected of a man of his station, his tall frame cutting an impressive figure in his black evening coat and immaculate white cravat. His dark hair, slightly longer than fashion dictated, fell across his forehead in a way that made more than one young lady's heart flutter as he passed. His blue eyes, however, remained distant, polite but unrevealing, as if he were observing the festivities from somewhere far removed. Lady Ashworth, the hostess of this magnificent Christmas ball, had truly outdone herself. Garlands of holly and ivy draped the walls, their deep green punctuated by clusters of red berries that gleamed like jewels in the candlelight. White roses cascaded from enormous urns positioned at intervals around the room, their petals so perfect they seemed almost artificial. The scent of pine mingled with the heady fragrances worn by the guests, creating an intoxicating atmosphere that spoke of celebration and possibility. Everything about the evening spoke of joy, of the promise that came with the Christmas season, of new beginnings and happy endings. Yet Adrian felt none of it. The joy, the promise, the hope, all of it seemed to exist in a world he could observe but never truly inhabit. He had attended dozens of such events, had danced with hundreds of eligible young women, had smiled and conversed and played his part to perfection. But tonight felt different. Tonight felt like an ending rather than a beginning, though he couldn't quite say why. He bowed to Miss Arabella Thornton, extending his hand for the quadrille with the practiced courtesy that came as naturally to him as breathing. She accepted with a delighted smile, her cheeks flushing pink beneath her carefully applied powder, as he led her onto the floor. She was a lovely girl, he noted absently, fair-haired, well-mannered, from an excellent family with considerable fortune. Exactly the sort of young woman his mother insisted he should consider for a wife. His mother had made that point abundantly clear just this morning, in fact, presenting him with a list of suitable candidates that might have been amusing if it hadn't been so depressing. As they moved through the intricate steps of the dance, Miss Thornton attempted conversation with the determined cheerfulness of a debutante who recognized an opportunity when she saw one. "What a splendid evening, Your Grace. Lady Ashworth has truly outdone herself this time. I don't believe I've ever seen such beautiful decorations, not even at Carlton House." "Indeed," Adrian replied, his voice pleasant but offering nothing more. He executed a perfect turn, guiding her through the complicated pattern with effortless skill. "And the musicians, are they not exceptional? I heard Lady Ashworth brought them all the way from Vienna. Imagine the expense. But then Lady Ashworth has always been known for her exquisite taste and generous hospitality." "They are quite talented," Adrian agreed, his responses automatic, requiring no actual engagement of his mind. "And the refreshments. Have you tried the champagne? Papa says it's French, smuggled in despite the difficulties. Terribly wicked, but then Christmas is a time for small indulgences, is it not?" "Quite so." Miss Thornton's smile faltered slightly at his brief responses, but she persevered with admirable determination. She tried several more conversational gambits, the weather, the latest fashions, some gossip about mutual acquaintances. But Adrian's mind was elsewhere, his attention divided, his eyes scanning the crowded ballroom for the one face he both longed to see and dreaded finding. The dance finally ended, and he escorted Miss Thornton back to her chaperone with impeccable courtesy, bowing over her hand with just the right degree of warmth to be polite without encouraging false hope. He saw the disappointment in her eyes as he withdrew, but he couldn't bring himself to care. He felt a pang of guilt for his lack of enthusiasm, for his inability to give these earnest young women the attention they deserved, But the guilt was distant, muted, unable to penetrate the numbness that had settled over him. Before he could retreat to the relative safety of the card room, where he might lose himself in the mechanical rhythms of whist or piquet, Lady Ashworth herself appeared at his elbow. She was a formidable woman in her 50s, handsome rather than beautiful, with shrewd eyes that missed very little. Her knowing smile suggested she had plans for him, and Adrian suppressed a sigh. There would be no escape tonight. "Your Grace, how wonderful to see you enjoying yourself," she said, though her sharp eyes suggested she saw right through his polite facade and recognized the emptiness beneath. "Might I impose upon you to dance with Miss Catherine Westbrook? The poor dear has been sitting out far too many dances this evening, and you know how cruel society can be to a girl who lacks partners. It would be such a kindness." Adrian knew a command disguised as a request when he heard one. Lady Ashworth had been a friend of his late mother's, and she wielded her social influence with the precision of a general directing troops. To refuse would be unthinkable, not merely rude, but a social catastrophe that would reflect poorly on his breeding and his respect for his mother's memory. He bowed graciously, manufacturing a smile. "It would be my pleasure, Lady Ashworth." And so it went. One dance after another, one polite conversation following the next, each as meaningless as the last. He partnered with Miss Westbrook, then Lady Charlotte Pemberton, then the Honourable Miss Jane Hartley. He danced with wallflowers who blushed and stammered their way through attempted conversation, and with diamonds of the first water who preened and flirted with practiced skill. He performed his duty as one of society's most eligible bachelors, with the dedication of a soldier on campaign, fulfilling every obligation, meeting every expectation, playing his role to perfection. Each time the music began, each time he took another young woman's hand and led her onto the floor. His eyes swept the ballroom with a desperate hope he tried hard to disguise. He told himself he wasn't searching, that his wandering gaze was merely the natural curiosity of a man observing his surroundings. But he knew it was a lie. He was searching, always searching, and each time he finally spotted her, his heart performed that familiar, painful twist that had become as much a part of him as breathing. Eleanor Hargrave stood near the terrace doors, engaged in conversation with Lady Bridget Carlyle and several other young women. Her slender figure was draped in a gown of deep emerald silk that made her auburn hair glow like embers in the candlelight. The dress was cut modestly, as befitted her status as an engaged woman, yet it somehow managed to be more alluring than the more daring creations worn by the unmarried girls. She wore no excessive jewelry, just a simple strand of pearls at her throat and small pearl drops at her ears, yet she outshone every elaborately adorned woman in the room. At least, she did to Adrian. But it wasn't just her beauty that drew his gaze again and again, that made it nearly impossible for him to focus on his dance partners or their cheerful attempts at conversation. It was the intelligence in her hazel eyes, visible even from across the crowded room. It was the warmth of her smile when she spoke to her companions, the graceful way she moved, the musical quality of her laugh when it carried across the ballroom to where he stood. It was the way she tilted her head when listening to someone, giving them her complete attention, making them feel as though they were the only person in the world. It was everything about her, everything he had tried so desperately to ignore for the past 3 seasons, everything that haunted his dreams and made waking a fresh torment. She wasn't looking at him. She never did anymore, not the way she once had. There had been a time years ago now when her face would light up when she saw him, when she would seek him out at gatherings, when they would spend hours in comfortable conversation about books and philosophy and all manner of things. They had been friends once, or so he had told himself, but friendship had been a lie, at least on his part. What he felt for Eleanor Hargrave had never been mere friendship, though it had taken him far too long to recognize the truth. Adrian watched as Eleanor conversed with Lady Bridget, their heads bent together in the way of women sharing confidences. Lady Bridget said something that made Eleanor laugh, and the sound of it pierced Adrian like a blade. He remembered making her laugh like that, remembered the warmth in her eyes when she looked at him, remembered when the distance between them had been measured in inches rather than the vast, unbridgeable gulf that now separated them. For a moment, as if sensing his gaze, Eleanor's eyes lifted and met his across the crowded ballroom. The contact lasted only a heartbeat before she looked away, but in that brief instant, Adrian felt the familiar ache intensify until it was almost unbearable. He saw something in her expression, sadness perhaps, or regret, or merely the polite acknowledgement of an acquaintance. He couldn't be sure, and the uncertainty was its own form of torture. He forced himself to turn away, to accept yet another invitation to dance from a blushing debutante whose name he immediately forgot. As he moved through the steps of the cotillion, he told himself the same things he had been telling himself for months now, the same rational arguments that did nothing to ease the pain. Eleanor Hargrave was engaged to be married. The announcement had been made at the beginning of the season, the contracts signed, the settlement negotiations concluded, the alliance between the Hargrave and Sutcliffe families sealed with all the formality and legal precision that such arrangements required. She was promised to Viscount Sutcliffe, heir to an earldom, a match that everyone agreed was eminently suitable. Lord Hargrave had been positively triumphant about it, speaking of the advantages of the connection at every opportunity. Everyone, apparently, except Adrian's stubborn heart, which refused to accept what his mind knew to be an immutable fact. His heart insisted on breaking a little more with each passing day, with each step that brought Eleanor's wedding closer to reality. He had loved her for years, quietly, hopelessly, from a distance that seemed to grow wider with each passing season. He had loved her when they were both barely out of the schoolroom, when she would visit his sister Isabel at Ravenshire Manor during the summer months, and he would find excuses to join them for tea or walks in the extensive gardens. He had loved her through her first season, when other men had begun to notice what he had known all along, that Eleanor Hargrave was extraordinary, that she possessed a rare combination of beauty, intelligence, and genuine kindness that made her worthy of far more than the shallow admiration most men offered. And he loved her now, even as he watched her stand beside the man she was supposed to marry, even as he danced with women he could never imagine loving the way he loved her. The worst part, the truly unbearable part, was that no one knew. He had been careful, so careful, to never let his feelings show, to maintain the careful facade of polite friendship that society required. No one suspected that beneath the polished exterior of the Duke of Ravenshire, cool and composed and always in perfect control, his heart was breaking slowly, fracturing a little more with each day that brought Eleanor's wedding closer. Society saw only what he allowed them to see, the eligible bachelor performing his duties with perfect propriety, the responsible peer fulfilling his obligations, the dutiful son still mourning his mother's death 3 years past. No one looked beneath the surface to see the man who lay awake at night, thinking of auburn hair and hazel eyes, who found excuses to attend events where Eleanor might be present, who treasured every brief conversation they managed to share as if each word were precious. The current dance ended, and Adrian found himself near the refreshment table, grateful for a moment's respite from the endless cycle of polite conversation and meaningless social interaction. He accepted a glass of champagne from a passing servant, French, as Miss Thornton had so breathlessly informed him, and probably smuggled given the ongoing difficulties with Bonaparte, and retreated to a relatively quiet corner of the ballroom, partially concealed by an enormous arrangement of white roses and holly. From this vantage point, he could observe without being immediately drawn into another social obligation. He could see Eleanor more clearly now, could study her without the fear of being caught staring. She stood with Viscount Sutcliffe now, her hand resting lightly on his arm in a gesture that seemed more dutiful than affectionate. Sutcliffe was speaking to Lord Pemberton about something that required serious expressions and much nodding, politics most likely, or perhaps estate management, while Eleanor smiled politely beside him, the perfect picture of an attentive fiancé. Adrian studied the man who would become Eleanor's husband, who would have the right to touch her, to kiss her, to share her bed and her life. He searched for the qualities that made Sutcliffe worthy of such a treasure, tried to understand what Eleanor saw in him that would make her agree to spend the rest of her life as his wife. Viscount Sutcliffe was handsome enough, Adrian supposed, with fair hair carefully styled, regular features that suggested good breeding, and the confident bearing of a man accustomed to privilege. He came from an old family with substantial estates in Kent and excellent connections throughout the ton. His reputation was respectable, his prospects excellent, his character, at least publicly, without blemish. On paper, he was everything a father could want for his daughter, everything society valued in a potential husband. Yet something about the man had always troubled Adrian, though he couldn't quite articulate what it was. Perhaps it was the way Sutcliffe's smile never quite reached his eyes, creating an impression of coldness beneath the polite facade. Perhaps it was the proprietary manner in which he treated Eleanor, as if she were already his possession, rather than a woman deserving of devotion and respect. Perhaps it was the way he seemed more interested in his conversation with Lord Pemberton than in the extraordinary woman standing quietly at his side. Or perhaps, Adrian admitted to himself with brutal honesty, he simply hated the man because Eleanor had agreed to marry him, because Sutcliffe would have everything Adrian wanted and would never appreciate how fortunate he was. "You're staring again, old friend. You really must learn to be more subtle." The voice came from beside him, dry and amused, and Adrian turned to find Marcus Ashford, his closest friend since their school days at Eton, looking at him with a mixture of sympathy and exasperation. Marcus was shorter than Adrian, with sandy hair and an open, friendly face that made people trust him instinctively. He was also far too perceptive for Adrian's comfort. "I wasn't aware I was staring," Adrian lied smoothly, though he knew Marcus wouldn't be fooled. Marcus raised an eyebrow, his expression skeptical. "Please, I've known you since we were boys. I can tell when you're lying, and I can certainly tell when you're watching Miss Hargrave with that particular expression on your face. You look like a man watching his dreams turn to ash, if you'll pardon the melodrama." Adrian took a long drink of champagne, wishing it was something stronger. "I don't know what you're talking about." "The devil you don't." Marcus moved closer, lowering his voice so they wouldn't be overheard by the clusters of guests nearby. "Why don't you do something about it, Adrian, before it's too late, before she's actually married to that pompous bore?" "It's already too late. She's engaged, the contracts are signed. Engagements can be broken. It happens more often than you might think. Not this one." Adrian's voice was flat, final. "You know as well as I do that Lord Hargrave would never allow it. The alliance with the Sutcliffes is exactly what he's wanted for Eleanor. A title, an estate, connections to one of the oldest families in England. Breaking the engagement would create a scandal that would ruin her prospects entirely. She'd be damaged goods, unmarriageable. I won't be responsible for that." Marcus was silent for a moment, his gaze drifting to where Eleanor stood. "Does she love him? Has she ever said?" The question pierced Adrian like a blade, sharp and precise, finding all the vulnerable places he tried to protect. "I don't know," he admitted quietly, the words costing him more than he cared to acknowledge. "She agreed to the match. That's all I know, that's all anyone knows." "That's not the same thing as love, and you know it." "No," Adrian agreed, his voice rough with suppressed emotion. "But it doesn't matter. She made her choice, or her father made it for her. Either way, the result is the same." "Did she make a choice, I mean? Or was she simply presented with a fait accompli and told to smile and accept it?" Adrian had asked himself the same question 100 times, had tortured himself with possibilities that changed nothing. He remembered the day the engagement was announced, remembered standing in the Hargraves' drawing room while Lord Hargrave spoke enthusiastically about the match. He remembered Eleanor's face, carefully composed, revealing nothing. He remembered waiting for her to look at him, hoping for some sign, some indication that she was unhappy with the arrangement. But she had looked at no one, had simply stood beside her father with perfect poise, while the ton offered their congratulations. "It makes no difference now," Adrian said finally. "The contracts are signed. The wedding date is set. In 3 months she'll be Viscountess Sutcliffe, and I'll have to find a way to live with it." The words tasted like ash in his mouth, bitter and choking. Marcus clapped a hand on his shoulder, the gesture speaking of understanding and sympathy. "I'm sorry, old friend, I truly am, but I still think you should tell her how you feel. What's the worst that could happen?" Adrian could think of several worse possibilities, each more painful than the last. She could reject him outright, confirming that she had never felt anything beyond friendship. She could be embarrassed by his declaration, making future interactions impossibly awkward. She could pity him, which would be worst of all. "I'd rather not find out," he said simply. Before Marcus could respond, Lady Ashworth materialized once more, her timing suggesting she had been watching for the appropriate moment to strike. She wore the determined expression that meant she had another dance partner selected for him, another obligation he was expected to fulfill. Adrian suppressed a sigh and allowed himself to be led away, back into the glittering whirl of the ball, back into the pretense that everything was perfectly fine, that he was simply a duke fulfilling his social obligations rather than a man slowly dying inside. As he moved through the next dance and the one after that, as he smiled and conversed and played his role with flawless precision, a part of him remained fixed on Eleanor. He was acutely aware of her presence in the room, could track her movements without even looking directly at her. It was as if some invisible thread connected them, pulling taut whenever she moved farther away, easing slightly when she drew closer. He wondered if she felt it too, this strange awareness, or if it was merely his own tortured imagination creating connections that didn't exist. The evening wore on with agonizing slowness. Adrian danced with what seemed like every eligible woman in London except the one he wanted. He laughed at jokes he barely heard, accepted compliments he didn't deserve, made conversation that meant nothing, and maintained the perfect facade that society expected of a man of his rank. And through it all, Eleanor remained just out of reach, close enough to see, close enough to hear her voice when she laughed, close enough to catch the faint scent of lavender when she passed, but impossibly distant nonetheless. As midnight approached and the musicians struck up one of the final waltzes of the evening, Adrian found himself standing at the edge of the dance floor, watching as Sutcliffe led Eleanor into position. They moved together with practiced ease, evidence of the many times they had danced together during their courtship. Adrian noticed that Eleanor's smile seemed strained, that her movements were a shade less graceful than usual, that she held herself slightly away from Sutcliffe even as they moved through the intimate steps of the waltz. He told himself he was imagining things, seeing what he wanted to see rather than what was actually there. "You should ask her to dance." The soft voice startled him out of his reverie. He turned to find his sister Isabel at his side, her brown eyes warm with understanding and concern. Isabel was younger than Adrian by 6 years, just 22, but she possessed a wisdom beyond her age and an uncanny ability to read his moods. "I don't know what you mean," he said automatically, the denial reflexive even though he knew Isabel would see through it. Isabel linked her arm through his, her touch gentle and grounding. "You've danced with every woman here tonight except Eleanor Hargrave. Don't you think people will notice? Isn't that more suspicious than simply asking her for one dance?" Adrian hadn't considered that possibility. He had been so focused on avoiding Eleanor, on protecting himself from the pain of being close to her, that he hadn't thought about how obvious his avoidance might appear to the sharp-eyed observers who populated the ton. Society thrived on gossip, on reading meaning into every gesture and glance. His deliberate avoidance of Eleanor might create exactly the kind of speculation he had been trying to prevent. "It's too late now," he said, nodding toward where Eleanor waltzed with Sutcliffe. "She's already engaged for this dance. The evening is nearly over. Then ask her for the next one. There's still time before the final dance concludes and everyone calls for their carriages." Adrian shook his head, panic rising in his chest at the mere thought. "I can't, Belle. I can't." His sister's expression softened with understanding and something that looked like heartbreak on his behalf. "You love her." It wasn't a question, and Adrian didn't bother denying it. There was no point in lying to Isabel, who had always been able to read him better than anyone, who had watched him silently suffer for months now. "It doesn't matter. She belongs to someone else. Does she? Or does she belong to the future her father chose for her? Again, it makes no difference. The contracts are signed, the wedding planned. In 3 months—" "You keep saying that," Isabel interrupted, her voice unusually sharp. "You keep reciting those facts as if they're immutable laws of nature, rather than human decisions that can be changed. You act as if you have no agency, no choice, no voice in your own happiness. What would you have me do? Create a scandal, ruin her reputation, destroy her family's carefully arranged alliance? For what? The slim chance that she might feel the same way I do?" Isabel was quiet for a moment, watching the dancers spin across the floor. When she finally spoke, her voice was gentle but firm. "Do you know why I've never married, Adrian?" The question surprised him, derailing his mounting frustration. You're only 22. You have plenty of time, and you've had no shortage of offers." "That's not what I asked." She looked up at him, her expression serious in a way that made him actually listen. "I've never married because I've watched you for the past 3 years, watching Eleanor Hargrave, loving her from afar, and I learned something important. I learned that life is too short to settle for anything less than the kind of love that makes your heart ache when you're apart. The kind of love that makes you dance with every woman in the ballroom, except the one you truly want, because being close to her would hurt too much. The kind of love that makes you willing to sacrifice your own happiness for hers." Adrian felt his throat tighten with emotion he couldn't quite name. "Belle, I've turned down 3 proposals of marriage, Adrian. 3 perfectly suitable gentlemen who could have given me everything society says I should want. But I turned them down because I don't love them, and I refuse to settle for less than what you have, even if you're too afraid to reach for it." "I'm not afraid. I'm being realistic. I'm being honorable." "You're being a coward," Isabel said, her words gentle but devastating. "And I say that with all the love in my heart. Don't waste this, Adrian. Don't let her go without at least telling her how you feel. You might not be able to change anything, but at least you'll know you tried. At least you won't spend the rest of your life wondering what might have been, if only you'd had the courage to speak." Before Adrian could formulate a response, before he could tell his sister all the reasons why her suggestion was impossible, the waltz ended and the couples began leaving the floor. Isabel squeezed his arm once more, pressed a kiss to his cheek, and then melted back into the crowd, leaving Adrian alone with his thoughts and the impossible suggestion she had planted in his mind. Tell Eleanor how he felt. The idea was simultaneously terrifying and tempting. What would he even say? How could he possibly express years of longing, months of silent suffering in a few brief moments at a crowded ball? And even if he could find the words, what good would it do? She was engaged to another man. At best, his confession would embarrass her. At worst, it would destroy the fragile friendship they had managed to maintain despite everything. And yet, as he watched Eleanor standing with Sutcliffe, her expression so carefully neutral, he couldn't quite dismiss his sister's words. What if Isabel was right? What if his silence was cowardice rather than nobility? What if Eleanor deserved to know the truth before she married a man who might never love her the way she deserved to be loved? The musicians began tuning their instruments for what would likely be the final dance of the evening. Around the ballroom, couples were forming up, making their selections for this last opportunity to take to the floor before the ball concluded and reality reasserted itself. Adrian watched as gentlemen approached ladies, as hands were extended and accepted, as the intricate social dance that preceded the actual dancing played out according to rules everyone understood. And then, before his mind could catch up with what his body was doing, before rational thought could reassert control, Adrian's feet were moving. He crossed the ballroom with steady purpose, his heart pounding so hard he was certain everyone could hear it, his hands trembling slightly despite his outward composure. He was vaguely aware of people watching him, of conversations pausing as he passed, of fans snapping open to facilitate whispered speculation. But he kept his eyes fixed on his destination, on the woman in emerald silk who had haunted his dreams for years. Eleanor stood with Sutcliffe and Lord Pemberton, apparently listening to some story the older man was relating with much gesturing and evident self-satisfaction. As Adrian approached, she looked up, and for the 3rd time that evening, their eyes met. This time, though, he didn't look away. This time he held her gaze, trying to communicate everything he felt in that brief moment of connection. "Miss Hargrave," he said, his voice steadier than he felt, years of training and proper deportment serving him well. He bowed with perfect correctness. "I wonder if I might have the honor of this dance." The request hung in the air for a moment, that seemed to stretch into eternity. Adrian was aware of Sutcliffe stiffening beside Eleanor, of Lord Pemberton's eyebrows rising with interest, of the sudden hush that seemed to fall over their immediate vicinity. But his attention remained fixed on Eleanor, on the rapid play of emotions across her face, surprise, confusion, something that might have been hope. Eleanor's eyes widened slightly, genuine shock flickering across her features before she could hide it. In all the months of her engagement, Adrian had been scrupulously careful to maintain his distance, to treat her with polite formality and nothing more. This sudden request must seem as surprising to her as his impulse to make it was to him. Sutcliffe recovered first, his voice smooth but edged with steel, carrying a warning Adrian chose to ignore. "I'm afraid Miss Hargrave has already promised this dance to me, Your Grace. We were just about to take our positions." Adrian finally looked at him, meeting the other man's gaze with the cool authority of someone who outranked him significantly. "My apologies, Sutcliffe. I didn't realize." He turned back to Eleanor, executing another perfect bow. "Perhaps another time, Miss Hargrave. I hope you'll forgive the intrusion." He was already turning away, already berating himself for his foolishness, for allowing hope and longing to overcome good sense, when Eleanor's voice stopped him. The words were quiet but clear, carrying a note of determination that sent hope surging through him. "Actually, Viscount Sutcliffe, I believe I promised this dance to Lady Bridget. We were planning to sit it out together and enjoy some refreshments. The evening has been rather exhausting." Adrian turned back slowly, hardly daring to believe what he was hearing, what she was doing. Eleanor met his eyes, and in that moment he saw something in her expression that made his pulse race. A flash of rebellion, of determination, of something he couldn't quite name, but that gave him more hope than he had felt in months. She extended her hand to him, the gesture deliberate and unmistakable. "I would be delighted to accept your invitation, Your Grace." Sutcliffe's face flushed with anger, his composure cracking to reveal the temper beneath. "Eleanor, I hardly think—" "Thank you for understanding, my lord," Eleanor said, her voice cool and composed, brooking no argument. She placed her hand in Adrian's, her fingers trembling slightly against his palm, the only sign that she was not as calm as she appeared. As Adrian led her toward the dance floor, he could feel the weight of dozens of eyes following them, could sense the ripples of interest and speculation spreading through the ballroom like rings in a pond. The Duke of Ravenshire, who had danced with every eligible woman tonight, who had been scrupulously careful to avoid any appearance of particular interest in the engaged Miss Hargrave, had finally claimed his dance. And Miss Hargrave, in an unprecedented move, had essentially lied to her fiancé to accept that dance. Tomorrow this would be all anyone in London talked about. Tomorrow the gossip would spread like wildfire, speculation would run rampant, reputations would be examined and judgments made. Tomorrow there would be consequences to face. But tonight, in this moment, as they took their positions and the opening notes of the waltz began, none of that mattered. Tonight Adrian would finally hold Eleanor Hargrave in his arms, would have this one perfect moment to treasure whatever came after. They took their positions as the opening notes of the waltz began, and Adrian placed his hand at Eleanor's waist, feeling the warmth of her through the silk of her gown. The contact sent a shock through him, as if touching her completed some circuit that had been broken for far too long. She rested her hand on his shoulder, her fingers trembling slightly, the only betrayal of nerves in an otherwise composed exterior. They began to move, and it was as if no time had passed at all, as if they had been dancing together all their lives rather than carefully avoiding each other across London's ballrooms for months. For several measures, neither of them spoke. They simply moved together with an ease that felt as natural as breathing, their bodies remembering what their minds had tried so hard to forget. Adrian was intensely aware of every point where they touched, his hand at her waist, her hand in his, the whisper of her skirt against his legs as they turned. He was aware, too, of the watching eyes, the whispered conversations behind fans, the speculation that would follow this single dance for weeks to come. But he found surprisingly that he didn't care. Let them watch, let them whisper. For this moment, Eleanor was in his arms, and nothing else mattered. "I thought you were trying to avoid me tonight," Eleanor said at last, her voice low enough that only he could hear, pitched beneath the swell of violins and the rustle of silk around them. Adrian's hand tightened fractionally at her waist, an involuntary response to the hurt he heard beneath her controlled tone. Was it that obvious? To me it was. Her hazel eyes met his, and he saw accusation there, and pain, and something else he couldn't quite name. "You danced with every other woman in this room, every single one, I counted." The admission that she had been watching him, tracking his movements as obsessively as he had been tracking hers, sent a thrill through him that he tried to suppress. I was fulfilling my obligations. And I wasn't one of them? The question came out more sharply than she seemed to intend, and he saw her swallow, visibly trying to regain her composure. Forgive me. That was inappropriate. No, Adrian said quietly, guiding them through a turn with practiced ease. It wasn't. And you're right. I was avoiding you. Why? The single word carried a weight of unspoken questions, of months of confusion and hurt. We were friends once, Adrian. Or have you forgotten? Have I done something to offend you so greatly that you can't even bear to dance with me at a ball where you've partnered every other lady in attendance? The use of his given name, spoken so softly that it was almost lost in the music, made something crack open inside him. It had been so long since she had called him anything but Your Grace, in that formal, distant tone society required of an engaged woman speaking to an unattached man. I haven't forgotten, he said, his voice rougher than he intended. I could never forget. Our friendship it meant everything to me. Then why? Eleanor's eyes searched his face as if looking for answers he wasn't sure he could give. Why have you been avoiding me for months? Why do you look right through me at social gatherings as if I'm not even there? Why does it feel as though you've decided I no longer exist? Adrian felt his throat tighten with emotions he had worked so hard to suppress. How could he possibly explain without revealing everything he had fought to conceal? How could he tell her that avoiding her was the only way he could bear to be in the same room with her, that looking at her hurt too much, that every conversation was a reminder of everything he couldn't have? I thought it would be easier, he finally admitted, the words inadequate but honest, for both of us. Easier? Eleanor's voice carried a note of incredulity mixed with hurt. Easier than what? Easier than maintaining the friendship we once shared. Easier than treating me like a human being rather than an obstacle to be avoided. Easier than pretending everything was the same when everything had changed. Something flickered in Eleanor's expression, recognition perhaps, or understanding of the deeper meaning beneath his carefully chosen words. They moved in silence for another moment, the waltz swirling around them, isolating them in their own small world despite the hundreds of people watching. Adrian could feel the weight of those watching eyes, could sense Sutcliffe's displeasure radiating from wherever he stood at the edge of the dance floor. Tomorrow there would be consequences. Tomorrow there would be questions to answer and gossip to weather. But tonight, in this moment, he had Eleanor in his arms, and he couldn't bring himself to regret it. I miss it, Eleanor said quietly, her voice barely audible above the music. I miss our friendship. I miss the conversations we used to have about philosophy and literature, the arguments where you would take one position and I would take the opposite just to watch you defend your point. I miss the walks in your garden when I would visit Isabel, when you would show me the new roses and tell me their Latin names, even though you knew I would forget them immediately. I miss knowing that I had someone who truly understood me, who saw me as something more than just a daughter to be married off or a wife to produce heirs. The longing in her voice nearly undid him. Adrian felt something inside him crack, the careful walls he had constructed around his heart beginning to crumble. Eleanor? Do you know why I agreed to dance with you tonight? She interrupted, her voice trembling slightly, despite her obvious effort to maintain control. Why I essentially lied to Viscount Sutcliffe about a prior engagement with Lady Bridget. Adrian shook his head, not trusting himself to speak. His heart pounding so hard, he was certain she must be able to feel it. Because I'm tired of pretending, Eleanor said, and there was something fierce in her expression now, something defiant, that reminded him of why he had fallen in love with her in the first place. I'm tired of smiling and nodding and playing the role of the perfect future Viscountess. I'm tired of having conversations about nothing, of attending events where I'm displayed like a piece of jewelry for people to admire and comment upon. I'm tired of living a life that doesn't feel like my own. And when you asked me to dance, when I saw the look in your eyes, she paused, seeming to gather courage. I just wanted one moment to be honest. One dance where I didn't have to pretend. Pretend what? Adrian asked, though a part of him wasn't certain he wanted to know the answer, wasn't sure he could bear whatever truth she was about to reveal. Eleanor's eyes met his, and in them he saw a world of unspoken emotion, pain and longing, and something that might have been desperation. That I'm happy with the choice that was made for me, that I'm looking forward to my wedding, that I'm in love with the man I'm supposed to marry. The admission hung between them, dangerous and electric, changing everything. Adrian knew he should say something proper, something that acknowledged her engagement and maintained the careful distance society required. He should offer some platitude about wedding nerves being normal, about how she would surely grow to love her husband in time. Instead, he heard himself ask the one question he had been afraid to voice. "Are you happy, Eleanor?" She didn't answer immediately. They completed another turn, their movements perfectly synchronized, despite the emotional turmoil swirling between them, as if their bodies understood something their minds were afraid to acknowledge. "Does it matter?" she finally said, and there was something infinitely sad in her smile, something defeated that made him want to pull her closer, to promise her that everything would be all right, even though he had no right to make such promises. "The contracts are signed. The wedding is planned. The invitations will be sent within the week. In 3 months I'll be Viscountess Sutcliffe, and all of this," she gestured vaguely to encompass the ballroom, the dance, the charged atmosphere between them, "will be nothing more than a memory." "It matters to me," Adrian said, the words escaping before he could stop them, before rational thought could reassert control. "Your happiness matters to me more than you know, more than perhaps it should." Eleanor's step faltered almost imperceptibly, and her hand tightened on his shoulder. For a moment he thought she might pull away, might end the dance and flee back to the safety of her fiancé's side. Instead, she drew in a shaky breath and looked up at him with eyes that glistened with unshed tears. "Adrian, please don't," she whispered, her voice breaking on his name. "Don't say things like that. Don't make this harder than it already is." "I'm sorry," he said quickly, cursing himself for his lack of control, for allowing his feelings to show so clearly. "Forgive me. I shouldn't have said that. I had no right—" "No," Eleanor interrupted, shaking her head slightly. "You shouldn't have, because you know as well as I do that it makes everything harder. It makes me question things I have no right to question, makes me wish for things that can never be." The music was building to its conclusion, their dance drawing to a close far too quickly. Adrian wanted to stop time, to hold this moment forever, to never let her go. But already he could see Sutcliffe approaching from the edge of the dance floor, his expression stormy, his stride purposeful. Already reality was reasserting itself, reminding them both of the world that existed beyond this brief, stolen moment. As the final notes faded and they came to a stop, Adrian reluctantly released her, though every fibre of his being screamed in protest. He bowed formally, she curtsied in return, and for one last moment their eyes met and held. "Thank you for the dance, Miss Hargrave," he said, keeping his voice carefully neutral for the benefit of those listening, though it cost him more than he cared to admit. "The pleasure was mine, Your Grace," she replied with equal formality, her mask of composure sliding back into place with practiced ease. But as he turned to escort her from the floor, she leaned in just slightly, close enough that her words reached only his ears, close enough that he could catch the faint scent of lavender that always surrounded her. "Thank you for asking me. Thank you for giving me this. I'll remember it always." Then Sutcliffe was there, claiming Eleanor's arm with a possessiveness that made Adrian's jaw clench, his hand proprietary on her elbow in a way that suggested ownership rather than affection. Adrian watched them walk away, watched as Eleanor was absorbed back into the life that had been chosen for her, and felt the distance between them expanding once more, wider and more unbridgeable than ever. The ball ended shortly after, guests calling for their carriages, the magic of the evening dissolving into the cold reality of a winter night. Adrian made his way through the thinning crowd, accepting Lady Ashworth's effusive thanks for his attendance and making the appropriate farewells. He avoided Marcus's knowing look, ignored his sister's worried expression, and escaped into his waiting carriage with a relief that bordered on desperation. As the carriage rolled through the snow-covered streets toward Ravenshire House, Adrian stared out at the white landscape and replayed every moment of that dance in his mind. He had tried so hard to avoid Eleanor tonight, convinced that staying away from her was the only way to protect his heart. But one dance had undone all his careful defenses, had reminded him of everything he stood to lose, had made the prospect of watching her marry another man nearly unbearable. She had said she wasn't happy. She had admitted in carefully chosen words that her engagement was not what she wanted, that she was simply fulfilling obligations placed upon her by her family. The knowledge should have given him hope, but instead it only made everything more painful. If Eleanor was unhappy, if she was marrying Sutcliffe only out of duty, then perhaps there was a chance, however slim, that things could be different. But that chance was slipping away with each day that passed, with each step that brought her wedding closer to reality. Adrian's carriage pulled up before Ravenshire House, and he climbed out into the cold night air, his breath misting before him. Inside, the household was quiet, the servants having left candles burning in the entrance hall for his return. He made his way to his study, knowing that sleep would be impossible, that his mind would give him no peace tonight. He poured himself a generous measure of brandy and settled into the leather chair by the fireplace, staring into the dying embers while his mind churned with questions that had no answers. What had Eleanor meant when she said she was tired of pretending? Was she simply referring to the social pretense required of an engaged woman, or was there something deeper in those words? And what did it mean that she had essentially lied to her fiancé to accept Adrian's invitation to dance? The clock in the corner chimed 3 times, marking the late hour, but Adrian made no move to retire. He sat in the darkness nursing his brandy, wrestling with the impossible situation in which he found himself. He loved Eleanor Hargrave with every fibre of his being, but she was engaged to another man. She seemed unhappy with that engagement, but the contracts were signed, the arrangements made. What right did he have to interfere? What right did he have to pursue his own happiness at the potential cost of her reputation and her family's carefully laid plans? The winter morning dawned grey and cold, with fresh snow covering the streets of London. Adrian had eventually made his way to bed in the early hours, but his sleep had been troubled, filled with dreams of Eleanor that left him feeling more exhausted upon waking than he had been when he retired. He went through his morning routine mechanically, allowing his valet to dress him, taking breakfast in solitude while scanning the Morning Post without really seeing the words on the page. He had just finished his coffee when Isabel burst into the breakfast room without ceremony, her cheeks flushed from the cold and her eyes bright with urgency. She didn't bother with pleasantries or apologies for the intrusion. "We need to talk. Now." Adrian set down his newspaper with a sigh that was more resignation than annoyance. "Good morning to you as well, Belle?" "Never mind the pleasantries," she said, settling into the chair across from him with barely contained energy. "Half of London is already talking about you and Eleanor Hargrave. By this afternoon it will be all of London. By tomorrow it will have reached every corner of the country. I danced with her once. Surely that's not grounds for such excessive gossip." "You danced with her after avoiding her all evening," Isabel corrected. "After dancing with every other woman in attendance, after she essentially lied to her fiancé to accept your invitation. Lady Worthington told Mama this morning that it was the most romantic thing she'd seen all season. Mrs. Pemberton said you looked like star-crossed lovers in a tragic play. Lady Carlisle said the tension between you was so thick she could have cut it with a knife." Adrian felt heat rising in his cheeks, embarrassment and frustration warring within him. People are reading far too much into a simple dance between old friends. "Was it simple?" Isabel challenged, her gaze penetrating in a way that made dissembling impossible. "Because from where I was standing it looked like anything but simple. It looked like 2 people who are desperately in love, but too afraid or too bound by duty to do anything about it." Adrian stood abruptly, moving to the window to stare out at the snow-covered garden, rather than face his sister's too perceptive gaze. "It doesn't matter what it looked like. Eleanor is engaged to be married. That's the end of it. It has to be." "Is it?" Isabel joined him at the window, her voice gentler now but no less insistent. "Adrian, I saw her face during that dance. I saw the way she looked at you. Whatever else may be true, that woman is not in love with Viscount Sutcliffe. And I don't think she ever has been. That's not for us to judge. Perhaps not, but it is for you to act upon if you truly love her." Before Adrian could respond to that impossible suggestion, his butler appeared in the doorway wearing an expression that suggested important news. "Your Grace, Lord Ashford is here to see you. He says it's rather urgent and cannot wait." Adrian exchanged a glance with Isabel, wondering what could bring Marcus to call so early in the morning. "Show him in, Dennison." Marcus appeared moments later, his usually cheerful expression replaced by something far more serious. He glanced at Isabel, then back at Adrian, clearly uncomfortable with having an audience for whatever news he carried. "Forgive the intrusion at such an hour. I've just come from White's, where I overheard something I thought you should know immediately. It concerns Viscount Sutcliffe." Adrian felt his stomach tighten with apprehension. "What about him?" Marcus hesitated, visibly uncomfortable, his usual confidence deserting him. "There are rumors, well-substantiated ones, I'm afraid, that Sutcliffe has been keeping a mistress, Mrs. Catherine Weston, a wealthy widow with a house in Mayfair. Worse, he's apparently been conducting the affair quite openly, even while courting Miss Hargrave. Multiple witnesses have seen them together at various locations around London." The words hit Adrian like a physical blow, rage and protectiveness surging through him in equal measure. "What did you say?" "Lord Pemberton was discussing it with several other gentlemen at the club this morning," Marcus continued, his discomfort evident. "Apparently Sutcliffe has been seen frequently at Mrs. Weston's residence at all hours. The affair has been going on for over a year, possibly longer. Pemberton himself saw them together at the opera just last week, behaving in a manner that left little doubt about the nature of their relationship." Isabel gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. "Does Eleanor know? Has anyone told her?" "I very much doubt it," Marcus said grimly. "These things are usually kept carefully hidden from the ladies. The gentlemen all know, of course. There's apparently been quite extensive wagering at the clubs about whether Sutcliffe would continue the affair after his marriage. But no one would think to inform Miss Hargrave. It's simply not done." Adrian's hands clenched into fists at his sides, fury making it difficult to think clearly. The idea of Sutcliffe touching Eleanor, claiming her as his wife while maintaining a mistress, conducting his deception with such brazen confidence that half of London knew about it, it made him sick with rage. How reliable is this information? Could it be mere gossip? "Very reliable, I'm afraid," Marcus said. "Pemberton is not a man given to spreading unfounded rumors, and he's not the only witness. Several members confirmed having seen Sutcliffe with Mrs. Weston at the theatre in various parks, even at certain less reputable establishments. The evidence is quite damning." "This is unconscionable," Isabel said, her voice shaking with anger. "Eleanor cannot be allowed to marry such a man. Someone must tell her. Someone must stop this wedding before it's too late." "It's not that simple," Adrian said, though his mind was already racing through possibilities, through scenarios and consequences. "If word of this gets out, if it becomes public knowledge, the scandal could damage Eleanor's reputation as much as Sutcliffe's. Society has a perverse way of blaming the woman for a man's infidelity, even when she's entirely innocent. She could be labelled as inadequate, unable to keep her husband's interest. Her prospects for any future marriage would be destroyed." "So what do we do?" Marcus asked, his expression troubled. "We can't simply let her marry him knowing this. That would be unconscionable. But you're right that we must be careful about how we proceed." Adrian moved back to the window, his thoughts in turmoil. Everything in him wanted to go to Lord Hargrave immediately, to expose Sutcliffe for the scoundrel he was, and rescue Eleanor from a disastrous marriage. But he also knew that such direct action could backfire spectacularly, could hurt Eleanor in ways he couldn't bear to contemplate. If he went to Lord Hargrave with this information, Hargrave might dismiss it as the jealous machinations of a rejected suitor. Worse, he might blame Eleanor somehow, might accuse her of encouraging Adrian's interference. "I need more information," he said finally, the decision crystallizing even as he spoke. "Marcus, can you gather more details? Specific dates and locations where they were seen together? Names of other witnesses beyond Pemberton? If we're going to bring this to Lord Hargrave, we need irrefutable proof that cannot be dismissed or explained away." "Of course. I'll make discreet inquiries today." After Marcus left, Adrian remained at the window, while Isabel came to stand beside him. She placed her hand on his arm, her touch gentle and grounding. "You have to tell her, Adrian, or at least tell her father. You can't let Eleanor walk into this marriage blind to what kind of man she's marrying." "I know," Adrian admitted, the words heavy with responsibility and fear. "But how do I do that without making it seem like I'm acting purely out of self-interest? Hargrave already knows I'm close to his daughter, that we were friends. If I come to him with this information, he might see it as nothing more than a jealous rival trying to sabotage his daughter's advantageous marriage." "Then perhaps," Isabel said softly, "it's time you told Eleanor yourself. Give her the information and let her make her own choice about what to do with it. Trust her to decide her own future." The suggestion both terrified and tempted him. What if he told Eleanor about Sutcliffe's betrayal and she chose to ignore it, to proceed with the wedding despite everything? What if she accused Adrian of lying, of fabricating evidence out of jealousy? The rejection, the loss of even her friendship, would be devastating. But then he thought of Eleanor's words at the ball. "I'm tired of pretending," and he felt something shift inside him. Isabel was right. He couldn't make this decision for Eleanor. He couldn't protect her by keeping silent. She deserved to know the truth about the man she was supposed to marry, and she deserved to make her own informed choice about her future. "I'll speak to her," he said, the decision both terrifying and liberating. "But first, I need the evidence Marcus mentioned. I won't go to her with mere gossip and rumors. She deserves better than that. She deserves facts." The next few days passed in a blur of careful investigation and mounting evidence. Marcus proved invaluable, using his extensive network of contacts and considerable social skills to gather information about Sutcliffe's affair. What they discovered was even worse than Adrian had imagined, each new piece of evidence adding to a picture of systematic deception and callous disregard. Sutcliffe had been conducting his affair with Mrs. Catherine Weston for over a year, starting well before he had even begun courting Eleanor. Multiple witnesses confirmed having seen them together at various locations: the opera, certain fashionable parks, several dinner parties at less reputable establishments. Mrs. Weston herself had apparently been quite indiscreet about the relationship, speaking openly to her friends about her Viscount, and expressing confidence that his impending marriage would have no impact on their arrangement. The evidence was damning, irrefutable, painting a picture of a man who viewed marriage purely as a business arrangement, who had no intention of giving up his pleasures merely because he was taking a wife. Adrian felt sick, thinking about Eleanor bound to such a man for the rest of her life, producing his heirs while he maintained his mistress, her intelligence and warmth wasted on someone who would never truly appreciate or value her. But having the evidence was one thing. Arranging to speak privately with Eleanor was quite another. She was an engaged woman under the watchful eye of society. Any private meeting between them would be instantly remarked upon, would create exactly the kind of scandal Adrian was trying to avoid. He needed some way to speak with her alone, some opportunity that wouldn't immediately compromise her reputation. The solution came from an unexpected source. Isabel had maintained her friendship with Eleanor, despite Adrian's attempts to distance himself, visiting her regularly and including her in various social activities. When Isabel mentioned casually that she was planning a small afternoon tea party for a few close friends, Eleanor had accepted the invitation with what seemed like desperate eagerness, as if grateful for any opportunity to escape the suffocating obligations of her engagement. "She needs friends right now," Isabel told Adrian after Eleanor's acceptance arrived. "I think she's far more unhappy than she lets anyone see. And I think she needs you, whether she realizes it or not." The day of Isabel's tea party arrived cold and clear, with brilliant sunshine turning the snow-covered grounds of Ravenshire House into a glittering wonderland. Adrian had deliberately planned to be away during the gathering, knowing that his presence would be inappropriate and would fuel exactly the kind of gossip they were trying to avoid. But Isabel, as always, had other ideas. "I've told Eleanor that I wanted to show her the new conservatory," she informed Adrian that morning over breakfast, her expression innocent, but her eyes sparkling with mischief. "The one you had built last summer with all those exotic roses. I mentioned that you've been spending considerable time there overseeing the plantings. I'll bring her to the conservatory at precisely 3 o'clock. You'll happen to be there, inspecting the new additions. Belle, this is manipulative and transparent. This is necessary and kind, she countered firmly. You need to talk to her privately, and she needs to hear what you have to say. I'm simply providing the opportunity. What you do with that opportunity is entirely up to you. Adrian couldn't argue with her logic, though he spent the rest of the morning in a state of nervous anticipation that was entirely unlike his usual composed demeanor. By the time 3 o'clock approached, he had changed his cravat 3 times, checked his appearance in the mirror more often than he cared to admit, and reviewed the packet of evidence Marcus had compiled until he could recite every detail from memory. He positioned himself in the conservatory as planned, genuinely examining the new roses that had been carefully cultivated in the glass-enclosed space. The warm, humid air was a welcome respite from the winter cold, and the scent of growing things, earth and blooms and green life, provided a small measure of calm to his racing thoughts. He heard them before he saw them, Isabel's cheerful voice and Eleanor's softer responses echoing down the marble corridor that led from the main house to the conservatory. His heart began to race, and he had to consciously force himself to breathe normally, to maintain at least the appearance of calm as the door opened. "Oh!" Isabel exclaimed with theatrical surprise. That would have been amusing under other circumstances. "Adrian, I didn't expect to find you here. We were just coming to see the new roses Miss Hargrave has heard so much about." Adrian turned, managing what he hoped was a convincingly surprised expression, though he suspected he fooled no one. "Belle, Miss Hargrave." He bowed to Eleanor, who had frozen in the doorway, her eyes wide with something that might have been alarm or might have been hope. "Perhaps we should come back another time," Eleanor said quickly, already starting to retreat, her face flushing with color. "We wouldn't want to interrupt—" "Nonsense," Isabel said brightly, practically pushing Eleanor into the conservatory with gentle but inexorable pressure. "You're both here now, and these roses really are spectacular. Adrian has been working with the head gardener to cultivate some truly remarkable varieties. Let me show you this one." She moved to the far end of the conservatory, gesturing enthusiastically toward a climbing rose with delicate pink blooms. For several minutes, they maintained the pretense of examining the plants, with Isabel providing a running commentary on each variety that revealed surprising knowledge of horticulture. But the tension in the room was palpable, the air thick with everything that remained unspoken between Adrian and Eleanor. "Oh dear," Isabel said suddenly, pulling an ornate watch from her pocket with another display of theatrical surprise. "I completely forgot. I promised Mama I would help her address invitations for her dinner party next week. I'm already terribly late. She'll be furious." She looked between Adrian and Eleanor with perfectly feigned innocence. "Miss Hargrave, would you mind terribly if Adrian escorted you back to the drawing room when you're finished admiring the roses? I really must run." Before either of them could respond, before Eleanor could protest or Adrian could suggest an alternative, Isabel had swept out of the conservatory with remarkable speed, leaving them alone in the warm, flower-scented space. An awkward silence fell, heavy and charged. Eleanor stood very still, her hands clasped tightly in front of her, her eyes fixed on a particularly beautiful white rose, as if it held the secrets of the universe. Adrian struggled to find the right words to begin the conversation he needed to have, the conversation that might change everything or destroy what little remained of their friendship. "I apologize for my sister's machinations," he finally said, his voice rougher than he intended. "I suspect she planned this entire scenario." Eleanor's lips curved in a small, sad smile that didn't reach her eyes. "She mentioned that you might be here when she invited me to see the conservatory. I think she believes we need to talk, and apparently she's decided to take matters into her own hands." "Do we? Need to talk, I mean." Eleanor finally looked at him, and the pain in her eyes was almost unbearable to witness. "I don't know. Should we? We're not who we used to be, Adrian. Too much has changed. Perhaps it would be better to simply maintain the polite distance we've been observing." The use of his given name sent warmth spreading through his chest, despite the sadness in her voice. "Aren't we still who we were? Or have we just been pretending to be different people to satisfy society's expectations?" Perhaps we've been pretending to be who we used to be, Eleanor said softly, her gaze drifting back to the roses. Perhaps that friendship we remember so fondly existed only in a different time, and we can't recapture it, no matter how much we might wish to. Adrian moved closer, close enough to catch the faint scent of lavender that always surrounded her, close enough to see the way her hands trembled despite her outward composure. What's changed, Eleanor? Really changed, beyond the obvious facts of your engagement and the social obligations that come with it. She shook her head, a gesture of helplessness and frustration. Everything. Nothing. I don't know anymore. I feel as though I'm living in a fog, going through the motions of a life that doesn't quite feel real, doesn't quite feel like mine. Are you happy? It was the same question he had asked at the ball, but this time there were no dancers around them, no audience to perform for, no need to maintain careful facades. Just the two of them and the truth, whatever that truth might be. Why do you keep asking me that? Eleanor's voice trembled slightly, her carefully maintained composure beginning to crack. What difference does it make whether I'm happy or miserable? The contracts are signed, the arrangements made, the future decided. My happiness is irrelevant. It's not irrelevant to me, Adrian said quietly but firmly. It will never be irrelevant to me, Eleanor. Your happiness matters more to me than perhaps it should, than perhaps I have any right for it to matter. Eleanor closed her eyes, and he saw a tear escape to trail down her cheek before she quickly wiped it away. When she opened her eyes again, they glistened with moisture she was fighting to contain. Then I'll tell you the truth, since we seem to be beyond pretense in this moment. No, I'm not happy. I haven't been happy since my father announced my engagement. Is that what you wanted to hear? I wanted to hear the truth, whatever that truth might be. Well, now you have it, she said, her voice breaking slightly despite her obvious effort to maintain control. I'm not happy, Adrian. I wake every morning with a sense of dread at what my future holds. I go through each day playing a role that feels increasingly false. I smile and nod and plan a wedding I don't want to a man I don't love. But it doesn't matter, does it? Happiness isn't always possible or even relevant. Sometimes we have to settle for duty and propriety and doing what's expected of us, regardless of what we might personally want. Do we? Adrian took another step closer, his heart pounding with a mixture of hope and fear. What if there was another choice? What if you didn't have to settle? There isn't another choice. The contracts are signed. Contracts can be broken, Adrian interrupted, his voice more forceful than he intended. Eleanor laughed, but there was no humor in the sound, only bitterness and resignation. Not without catastrophic scandal, not without destroying my family's reputation and my father's carefully constructed alliance with the Sutcliffes, not without making myself unmarriageable and bringing shame upon everyone connected to me. So yes, technically contracts can be broken, but the cost of doing so would be far too high. What about your life, Eleanor? What about the next 50 or 60 years you'll spend bound to a man who doesn't make you happy? Isn't that too high a cost? She pulled away from him, moving to the conservatory window, where she could look out at the snow-covered garden beyond the glass. You make it sound so simple, as if happiness were the only consideration, as if duty and family and reputation meant nothing. I'm not saying they mean nothing. I'm saying you deserve more than a lifetime of unhappiness in service to those things. And what about what I deserve matters? Eleanor asked, turning back to face him with something like desperation in her expression. Because if we're being honest, if we're beyond pretense, then you should know that what I deserve and what I can have are two entirely different things. I deserve to marry someone who loves me, who values my intelligence and my opinions, who wants me for more than just my family connections and my ability to produce heirs. But that's not the marriage my father arranged, and I don't have the luxury of refusing it without consequences. I'm not willing to inflict on my family. Adrian couldn't stop himself from reaching out, from taking her hand in his, despite the impropriety of the gesture. She started at the contact but didn't pull away, and he felt the trembling in her fingers as they rested in his palm. What if I told you, he said carefully, his heart in his throat, that you could have what you deserve, that there was someone who loves you exactly as you described, who has loved you for years, who would spend every day of his life trying to make you happy. Eleanor's breath caught and her eyes searched his face with an intensity that made him feel exposed, vulnerable in a way he had never allowed himself to be before. "Adrian, I have to tell you something," he said, knowing he couldn't delay any longer, that this moment might be his only chance. "About Sutcliffe. Something you need to know before you marry him." Her expression shifted from vulnerable hope to guarded concern. "What about him?" Adrian pulled the packet of evidence from his pocket, Marcus's carefully documented notes, witness statements, dates and locations, everything they had compiled over the past few days. "He's been unfaithful to you, Eleanor. He's been conducting an affair with a Mrs. Catherine Weston for over a year, long before he ever began courting you. Multiple reliable witnesses have seen them together. The affair is apparently common knowledge among the gentlemen at White's, though carefully hidden from society's ladies." The colour drained from Eleanor's face as he spoke, shock and hurt, and something that might have been relief warring in her expression. She took the papers from him with shaking hands, her eyes scanning the contents with growing horror. "I'm so sorry," Adrian continued, hating that he was the one to deliver this pain, but knowing she needed to hear it. "I know this is painful, but you deserve to know the truth before you bind yourself to him for life. Sutcliffe has no intention of giving up his mistress after the wedding. He views marriage as a business arrangement that shouldn't interfere with his pleasures." Eleanor read through the evidence slowly, methodically, her face growing paler with each revelation. When she finally looked up, tears were streaming freely down her cheeks, but there was also something like determination in her expression. "I should have known," she said, her voice hollow and distant. "All those evening engagements he couldn't miss, all those times he seemed distracted during our conversations, the way he never seemed particularly interested in spending time with me unless there was an audience to observe us. I told myself I was imagining things, being foolish and insecure, but I wasn't, was I? I was seeing the truth and I just didn't want to acknowledge it." "This isn't your fault, Eleanor," Adrian said fiercely, unable to bear hearing her blame herself for another man's betrayal. "None of this is your fault. You are perfect exactly as you are. If Sutcliffe was too much of a fool to recognize what an extraordinary gift he was being given, if he chose to throw away the chance to be loved by someone like you, that's his failing, not yours." Eleanor closed her eyes, and for a moment she swayed slightly, as if the weight of the revelations was too much to bear. Without thinking, Adrian stepped forward and pulled her into his arms, and after a moment's hesitation, she collapsed against him, her tears soaking into his coat as sobs shook her slender frame. He held her while she cried, one hand stroking her hair, while the other held her close, murmuring wordless comfort. He had dreamed of holding her like this for years, but not like this, never like this. He had wanted to hold her in joy, in passion, in love, not in grief and betrayal, and the shattering of whatever small hopes she might have maintained for her marriage. Eventually her sobs quieted to shuddering breaths, and she pulled back slightly, though she didn't leave the circle of his arms. She looked up at him with red-rimmed eyes, her face blotchy from crying but still beautiful to him, still the woman he loved more than life itself. "What am I going to do?" she whispered, the question carrying the weight of her entire future. "You're going to break the engagement," Adrian said firmly, as if saying it with enough conviction could make it true, could overcome all the obstacles that stood in their way. "You're going to tell your father what Sutcliffe has done, and you're going to be free of him. You're going to reclaim your life and your future. And then what? Face the scandal of being a woman who couldn't keep her fiancé's interest. Watch as society whispers about what I must have lacked to drive him to another woman's bed, become an object of pity or scorn. My prospects for any other marriage will be destroyed. I'll bring shame upon my family. My father will be furious. Better all of that than a lifetime married to a man who will never value you as you deserve," Adrian argued, his hands gently cupping her face, using his thumbs to wipe away the tears that continued to fall. "Better a temporary scandal than permanent misery." Eleanor searched his face, her expression torn between hope and despair. "Why do you care so much, Adrian? Why does my future matter so much to you?" This was the moment. This was when he either told her the truth or lost her forever. Adrian took a deep breath, gathering every ounce of courage he possessed, and spoke the words he had held inside for so long. "Because I love you," he said, his voice rough with emotion, but absolutely certain. I have loved you for years, Eleanor. I loved you when you were too young for me to speak, and I loved you through every season we spent pretending to be just friends. I love you now, even though I thought I had lost you forever, and I will love you for the rest of my life whether you marry Sutcliffe or someone else or no one at all. You're the first thing I think about when I wake, and the last thought before I sleep. You're in every plan I make for the future, every dream I allow myself. You're my heart, Eleanor. You always have been. Tears were streaming down Eleanor's face now, but she was also smiling through them, the first genuine smile he had seen illuminate her features in months. The expression transformed her, made her radiant despite the tears, despite the revelations that had shattered her carefully constructed composure. "You absolute fool," she said, her voice trembling with emotion, but carrying an undercurrent of something that might have been joy. "How could you not tell me? How could you let me believe for all these months that you saw me as nothing more than a friend, nothing more than your sister's companion?" "Because I thought you were happy with your choice," Adrian said, his hands still cradling her face with infinite gentleness, his thumbs continuing their gentle path across her tear-stained cheeks. "Because I didn't want to burden you with feelings you might not return. Because I was a coward who convinced himself that silence was nobility when it was really just fear of rejection." "You truly love me?" Eleanor asked, searching his face as if looking for any sign of doubt, any hint that this might be some cruel jest or misunderstanding. "With everything I am," Adrian said simply, the words carrying the weight of years of suppressed longing, of silent suffering, of love that had grown stronger despite every attempt to contain it. "You're the first thing I think about when I wake, and the last thought before I sleep. You're in every plan I make for the future, every dream I allow myself to have. You're my heart, Eleanor. You always have been, even when I tried to pretend otherwise, even when I convinced myself that friendship was enough." Eleanor made a sound that was half laugh, half sob, her hands coming up to cover his, where they still cupped her face. "I thought I was going mad," she said, the words tumbling out as if a dam had broken, as if years of carefully guarded secrets could no longer be contained. "All these months, I kept thinking about you, wishing things were different, wondering if maybe the way you looked at me sometimes meant something more than friendship. But I told myself I was being foolish, that you had never seen me as anything more than Isabel's friend, that I was imagining things because I was so desperately unhappy with my engagement." "You wondered?" Adrian's heart was pounding so hard he was certain she could hear it, could feel it in the trembling of his hands against her face. "Eleanor, does that mean—" "I love you too," she said, the words rushing out as if she couldn't contain them any longer, as if speaking them was both liberation and confession. "I've loved you for so long, Adrian. I think I started falling in love with you during those afternoons in the library at Ravenshire Manor, when you would argue with me about philosophy and politics, and actually listen to my opinions instead of dismissing them the way everyone else did. I loved you when you danced with me at my first ball and told me I was going to take London by storm, when you made me feel brave and beautiful, instead of terrified. I loved you when you pulled me aside after my mother died and just held me while I cried, when you didn't try to offer empty platitudes but simply gave me the space to grieve." She was crying in earnest now, but she was also laughing, and Adrian found himself doing the same as he pulled her into his arms properly, holding her close against his chest, as if he could somehow shield her from all the pain and uncertainty that lay ahead. For a moment, they simply stood there in the warm conservatory surrounded by roses, holding each other with a desperate intensity born of years of separation and suppressed longing. "Why didn't you say anything?" Adrian asked, his voice muffled against her hair, breathing in the scent of lavender and roses and Eleanor. "Why did you agree to marry Sutcliffe if you didn't love him?" "For the same reasons you didn't speak," Eleanor said, her voice trembling but growing stronger with each word. "Because I thought you saw me as a little sister, someone to be protected, but never truly desired. Because my father had other plans, and I was raised to be dutiful and obedient. Because I was afraid of what would happen if I refused. My father was so pleased with the match, so proud of the alliance he had secured. How could I tell him that I didn't want it, that my heart belonged to someone else entirely?" She pulled back just enough to look up at him, her hazel eyes still glistening with tears, but also bright with something that looked like hope. But I'm not afraid anymore. Not now that I know the truth about Sutcliffe, and not now that I know you love me. I refuse to spend the rest of my life trapped in a loveless marriage, pretending to be happy while my husband keeps his mistress. I refuse to give up the possibility of real happiness, of being with you." Adrian felt hope blooming in his chest, like the roses surrounding them, fragile but growing stronger with each passing moment. "Eleanor, are you certain? The scandal when you break the engagement. It won't be easy. Society can be vicious, especially to women who defy expectations." "I'm certain," she said firmly, her chin lifting with a determination he had always admired. "The scandal will pass eventually. Scandal always does, particularly when the truth about Sutcliffe's behavior becomes known. But if I marry him, I'll be trapped in that mistake for the rest of my life. And now that I know you love me, now that I've said the words I've held inside for so long—" She reached up to touch his face, her fingers gentle against his cheek. "I refuse to give up this chance at happiness. I refuse to give up you." Adrian caught her hand, pressing a kiss to her palm with a reverence that made her breath catch. "I'll stand with you through whatever comes. I'll face down anyone who dares to criticize you. I'll protect you from the worst of the gossip and support you through every difficulty. You won't face this alone, Eleanor. I promise you that." "I know," Eleanor said softly, her voice carrying absolute trust. "I know you will. Because that's who you are, that's why I love you." He couldn't stop himself then. He leaned down and kissed her, a gentle brush of lips that felt like coming home after a long journey. Eleanor's arms went around his neck, and for a moment the world outside the conservatory ceased to exist. There was only the two of them, finally honest, finally together, finally allowing themselves to feel what they had suppressed for so long. When they finally pulled apart, both slightly breathless, Eleanor rested her forehead against his. "I should go," she said reluctantly, though she made no move to leave the circle of his arms. "My maid will be wondering where I am, and if we're going to do this properly, we need to be careful about appearances until the engagement is broken. We can't give society any ammunition to use against us." "Tomorrow," Adrian said, his arms tightening around her for just a moment before reluctantly releasing her. "Tomorrow I'll go with you to speak to your father. We'll present him with the evidence about Sutcliffe, and we'll tell him that you're breaking the engagement." Eleanor nodded, squaring her shoulders as if preparing for battle. "Tomorrow." They left the conservatory separately, maintaining the proprieties, even as everything between them had fundamentally changed. Adrian watched her go, his heart fuller than it had been in months, allowing himself to hope for the first time since her engagement had been announced. But he also knew that the hardest part was still to come. They would have to face Lord Hargrave, endure his anger and disappointment, weather the storm of gossip and scandal that would follow. It wouldn't be easy, but as he watched Eleanor walk away with her spine straight and her step confident, he knew that she was strong enough to face it, and he would be beside her every step of the way. The next morning dawned cold and clear, sunlight glittering off the fresh snow that had fallen during the night. Adrian rose early, too anxious to sleep, and spent an hour reviewing the evidence Marcus had compiled, preparing himself for the confrontation ahead. He dressed with particular care, knowing that first impressions would matter, that he needed to appear as the respectable duke he was, rather than a jealous rival attempting to sabotage a competitor. Eleanor's note arrived shortly after breakfast, delivered by a trusted servant. The message was brief but significant. Her father had agreed to see them both at 11 o'clock. She had already told Lord Hargrave that serious allegations had been made against Viscount Sutcliffe, allegations that required immediate attention and discussion. The fact that Hargrave had agreed to the meeting suggested he was taking the matter seriously, though Adrian harbored no illusions about how difficult the conversation would be. He arrived at Hargrave House precisely on time, his stomach in knots despite his outward calm. The butler showed him to Lord Hargrave's study, where Eleanor was already waiting with her father. She looked pale but composed, dressed in a simple day dress of dove grey that made her seem younger and more vulnerable than usual. When their eyes met, however, he saw determination there and courage and something that gave him strength for what lay ahead. Lord Hargrave was a tall, imposing man in his late 50s, with silver hair and the sharp eyes of someone who had spent a lifetime in business and politics, missing nothing. He regarded Adrian with an expression that gave away nothing of his thoughts, his face a careful mask of polite neutrality that nevertheless carried an undercurrent of suspicion. "Your Grace," he said formally, gesturing to a chair opposite his massive mahogany desk. "Please, sit. My daughter has made some rather serious allegations regarding Viscount Sutcliffe. I confess I'm curious about your role in bringing these matters to light." Adrian sat, very aware of Eleanor's presence beside him, drawing strength from her nearness, even as he prepared to face her father's scrutiny. "My lord, I wish I were bringing you better news. But I felt it was my duty to ensure that Miss Hargrave knew the truth about the man she was preparing to marry, regardless of any personal cost to myself." "Personal cost," Lord Hargrave repeated, his tone suggesting he heard the implications beneath the carefully chosen words. "That's an interesting phrase, Your Grace. Might I assume you have some personal interest in my daughter's marital arrangements?" Adrian met his gaze steadily, refusing to be intimidated despite the weight of authority in Hargrave's expression. "I do, my lord. But that interest doesn't change the facts of what Viscount Sutcliffe has been doing. These are not merely allegations or unfounded rumors. They are documented facts, supported by multiple reliable witnesses and considerable evidence." He produced the packet Marcus had compiled and placed it on the desk between them. Lord Hargrave took the documents and began reading through them with agonizing slowness, his expression growing darker with each page. Adrian watched as anger replaced neutrality, as the older man's jaw clenched until the muscle jumped beneath his skin, as his hands tightened on the papers until they crumpled slightly at the edges. "This is unacceptable," Lord Hargrave said at last, his voice cold with barely controlled fury. "Absolutely unacceptable that he would dare to treat my daughter with such disrespect, such dishonor, conducting an affair openly while courting her, planning to continue that affair after their marriage." He looked at Eleanor, and for the first time, Adrian saw something like apology in his eyes. "My dear child, I am so sorry. I thought Sutcliffe was a man of honor, worthy of you. I would never have arranged the match if I had known he was capable of such deception." "I know, Papa," Eleanor said quietly, her voice steady despite the emotion Adrian could see in her eyes. "You wanted the best for me. You thought you were securing my future." "I wanted an alliance with the Sutcliffe family," Lord Hargrave admitted, his voice heavy with regret. "I wanted the prestige and connections that marriage to a viscount would bring. I was thinking of family advancement, of social position, of all the wrong things. I should have been thinking of your happiness." He turned back to Adrian, his eyes narrowing with renewed suspicion. "And what is your role in all this, Your Grace? How did you come by this information? And more importantly, what is your interest in ensuring my daughter knows about Sutcliffe's betrayal?" This was the moment of truth. Adrian could lie, could pretend that his motives were purely altruistic, purely based on concern for Eleanor's well-being as a family friend. But Eleanor deserved better than more deception, and so did her father. He took a deep breath and spoke the words that would change everything. "I love her, sir," he said simply, his voice carrying absolute conviction. "I have for some time, but I would have brought this information to you regardless of my personal feelings, because Eleanor deserves better than a man who would betray her before they're even married. She deserves to be loved and cherished and valued, not treated as a mere business arrangement while her husband maintains his pleasures elsewhere." Lord Hargrave was silent for a long moment, studying Adrian with an intensity that was almost unnerving. Finally he sighed, the sound carrying years of accumulated wisdom and experience. "I suppose I should have seen this coming. The way you two looked at each other at the Ashworth Ball. I'm old, Your Grace, not blind. I saw the way my daughter danced with you, the way she looked at you, and I realized that perhaps I had been too hasty in arranging her match with Sutcliffe, too focused on the advantages of the alliance to consider whether Eleanor actually wanted it." He turned to Eleanor, his expression serious but not unkind. "Do you love him? The Duke?" Eleanor lifted her chin, meeting her father's eyes with courage that made Adrian's heart swell with pride. "Yes, Papa, I do. I have for years." "And you wish to break your engagement to Sutcliffe?" "I do." Lord Hargrave nodded slowly, seeming to come to some internal decision. "Very well. I'll handle Sutcliffe and the dissolution of the engagement contracts. There will be scandal when the engagement is broken, but—" He glanced at the evidence still sitting on his desk, his expression hardening. "When the truth about his behavior becomes known, as I will ensure it does discreetly but effectively, any blame will fall on him rather than on you. Society will understand that no father would allow his daughter to marry such a man, regardless of the social advantages." "Thank you, Papa," Eleanor said, her voice thick with emotion and relief. Lord Hargrave stood, an imposing figure even as grief and regret flickered in his eyes. "You have my blessing," he said at last, his voice husky with emotion he was trying to control. He fixed Adrian with a hard look that revealed not a landowner or peer making business arrangements, but a father surrendering his daughter to another's care. "But remember this, Your Grace. Happiness is easily destroyed by pride or indifference, or taking the other person for granted. If I give you my daughter, I expect you to treasure her every day of your life. I expect you to value her intelligence and her spirit, to support her ambitions and her interests, to make her happiness your primary concern. Can you promise me that?" "I can, and I do," Adrian said, rising to face the older man with equal gravity. "I will spend every day of my life trying to make her happy, trying to be worthy of the gift you're giving me. You have my word as a gentleman, and my sacred promise as a man who loves your daughter more than life itself." Lord Hargrave studied him for another long moment, then nodded slowly. "Very well. You have my permission to court Eleanor properly, with the hope that she might eventually consent to become your wife. Though from the way she's looking at you, I suspect that consent has already been given." Eleanor blushed but didn't deny it, and Adrian felt his heart soar with joy so intense it was almost painful. The days that followed were a whirlwind of activity and emotion. Lord Hargrave moved swiftly to dissolve the engagement, meeting with Sutcliffe privately to present the evidence of his infidelity. The Viscount, when confronted with irrefutable proof, had the audacity to seem surprised that anyone objected to his arrangement, suggesting that most men of his station maintained mistresses and saw nothing wrong with the practice. Lord Hargrave's response was swift and unequivocal. The engagement was ended, the contracts dissolved, and if Sutcliffe wished to avoid complete social ruin, he would accept the dissolution quietly and spread no malicious rumors about Eleanor. The announcement caused exactly the scandal Adrian had anticipated. Society buzzed with speculation about why such an advantageous engagement had been broken so suddenly. But Lord Hargrave proved as good as his word, quietly letting certain influential people know the truth about Sutcliffe's behavior, while publicly maintaining that the dissolution had been by mutual agreement and with no ill will on either side. The truth spread through London's drawing rooms with the speed that only really scandalous gossip could achieve, and within a week, the Tun's judgment had shifted decisively against Sutcliffe rather than Eleanor. The Viscount found himself suddenly unwelcome at many social gatherings. Mothers of eligible daughters viewed him with suspicion. Men who had previously considered him a friend began to distance themselves, uncomfortable with the blatant disrespect he had shown to his fiancée. Mrs. Catherine Weston, finding herself the subject of uncomfortable attention and gossip, quietly left London for an extended visit to relatives in the country. Sutcliffe himself eventually retreated to his estate in Kent, his reputation damaged and his marriage prospects considerably diminished. Meanwhile, Adrian began his courtship of Eleanor with a joy he had never expected to experience. With her father's blessing and society's cautious approval, for a duke was always an acceptable suitor, regardless of the circumstances, he was free to call on her, to take her driving in Hyde Park, to dance with her at balls, without worrying about creating scandal. Every moment spent in her company was a gift, every conversation a reminder of why he had fallen in love with her in the first place. They spent long afternoons in the library at Ravensshire House, discussing books and philosophy, as they had in the old days, but now without the careful distance they had previously maintained. They walked in the conservatory among the roses, Adrian teaching her the Latin names he had once mentioned casually, Eleanor teasing him about his obsessive attention to botanical detail. They attended the theatre together, sat beside each other at dinners, danced at balls with the easy grace of two people perfectly attuned to each other. But it wasn't all effortless joy. There were challenges, moments when the weight of society's judgment felt crushing. Some members of the ton viewed Eleanor with suspicion, wondering if perhaps she had encouraged the Duke's interest while still engaged to Sutcliffe, if perhaps her broken engagement was evidence of inconstancy rather than good judgment. There were whispered conversations that stopped when Eleanor entered a room, knowing looks exchanged behind fans, small cruelties delivered with smiles. Adrian watched Eleanor navigate these challenges with a grace and dignity that made him love her even more. She held her head high, refusing to be cowed by gossip or innuendo. She maintained her friendships with those who truly mattered, Lady Bridget Carlyle chief among them, and ignored the opinion of those whose judgment was based on rumour rather than facts. She showed a strength of character that society had never required of her before, and she rose to meet the challenge with courage that took his breath away. Isabel became Eleanor's staunchest defender, using her position as the Duke's sister to deflect criticism and redirect conversation whenever someone tried to spread malicious gossip. Marcus Ashford proved equally valuable, quietly ensuring that the truth about Sutcliffe's behaviour remained in circulation among the gentlemen's clubs, providing context that explained and justified Eleanor's broken engagement. As spring arrived and London began to bloom, Adrian found himself increasingly impatient with the slow pace of courtship that propriety demanded. He wanted to marry Eleanor immediately, to make her his duchess and his wife, to begin the life together that he had dreamed about for so long. But he also knew that rushing would only feed society's gossips, would provide ammunition to those who whispered that the courtship was unseemly or improper. So he waited, courting her with all the patience he could muster, demonstrating to society and to Eleanor's father that his love was serious and enduring, not some passing infatuation or opportunistic pursuit. He sent her flowers, roses from his conservatory, carefully selected and presented with notes that quoted poetry and philosophy. He escorted her to every social event she attended, his presence a shield against the worst of society's judgment. He spent evenings at Hargrave House playing cards with her father, building a relationship based on mutual respect and shared concern for Eleanor's happiness. And slowly, gradually, society's opinion shifted. The whispers became less frequent, the knowing looks less common. People began to see what Adrian had always known, that Eleanor and he were perfectly suited, that their love was genuine and deep, that they brought out the best in each other. Invitations began arriving addressed to both of them, suggesting that the ton was beginning to view them as a couple, rather than as separate individuals with a scandalous history. One evening in early April, as they walked together in the garden at Ravenshire House with Isabel serving as their chaperone from a discreet distance, Adrian decided he could wait no longer. The setting sun painted the sky in shades of gold and rose, and Eleanor's face was luminous in the soft light. They stood beneath an ancient yew tree, the same spot where they had shared so many conversations in years past, and Adrian felt the rightness of the moment settle over him like a blessing. "Eleanor," he said, taking both her hands in his heart pounding with nervousness despite the certainty of what he was about to do. "We've known each other for years, been friends for most of that time, and in love for longer than either of us was willing to admit. You've seen me at my best and my worst. You know my flaws and my virtues, my strengths and my weaknesses, and despite all of that, or perhaps because of it, I love you more than I thought it possible to love another person." Tears were already gathering in Eleanor's eyes, but she was smiling, that radiant smile that made his breath catch every time he saw it. "I don't want to wait any longer," Adrian continued, his voice rough with emotion. "I don't want to spend another day pretending that you're not already my heart, my home, everything I've ever wanted. Eleanor Hargrave, would you do me the extraordinary honour of becoming my wife? Will you be my duchess, my partner, my love for all the days of our lives?" "Yes," Eleanor said, the word coming out as half laugh, half sob. "Yes, Adrian, 1,000 times yes. I would follow you through every winter, through every challenge, as long as each spring, each new season, we find ourselves together." Adrian pulled a ring from his pocket, a sapphire surrounded by diamonds, the blue stone exactly the colour of Eleanor's eyes when she laughed, and slipped it onto her finger. Then he pulled her into his arms and kissed her properly, thoroughly, with all the love and longing he had suppressed for so many years. Behind them, he heard Isabel's delighted squeal, but he paid no attention. There was only Eleanor, finally and irrevocably his. The wedding was planned for late May, a time when London society would be at its peak and when the gardens at Ravenshire Manor would be in full bloom. Eleanor wanted to be married in the small chapel on the estate rather than in one of London's grander churches, preferring intimacy and meaning over spectacle. Adrian agreed immediately, wanting nothing more than to make her happy, to give her the wedding she wanted rather than the one society expected. The preparations consumed the household for weeks. Isabel threw herself into the planning with joyful enthusiasm, helping Eleanor select fabrics and flowers, plan menus and seating arrangements, coordinate all the 1,000 details that went into a ducal wedding. Lord Hargrave, having fully reconciled himself to the match and genuinely pleased with his daughter's happiness, spared no expense to ensure that Eleanor had everything she wanted. The day of the wedding dawned clear and beautiful, with the kind of perfect spring weather that seemed like a blessing from heaven itself. The air was warm but not too hot, carrying the scent of roses and fresh grass and all the promises of summer to come. The small chapel was filled with flowers, white roses and lilies, Eleanor's favourites, and with the people who mattered most to both of them. Adrian stood at the altar in his formal attire, his heart racing as he waited for his bride to arrive. Marcus stood beside him as his groomsman, offering quiet encouragement and the steadying presence of lifelong friendship. The small gathering of guests represented both families and their closest friends, people who had supported them through the challenges, who understood the depth of their love and celebrated it without reservation. Then the music began, and Eleanor appeared in the doorway on her father's arm, and Adrian forgot how to breathe. She wore a gown of ivory silk, simple and elegant, with delicate embroidery at the hem and sleeves. Her auburn hair was dressed with white roses, and she carried a small bouquet of the same flowers mixed with ivy. But it was her face that captured him completely, radiant with joy, luminous with love, more beautiful than anything he had ever seen. As she walked down the aisle toward him, their eyes met and held, and Adrian felt the last pieces of his heart that had remained guarded and protected crack open completely. This woman, this extraordinary person who had challenged him and inspired him and loved him despite all his failings, was about to become his wife. The knowledge filled him with a joy so profound it was almost frightening in its intensity. Lord Hargrave placed Eleanor's hand in Adrian's with a solemnity that spoke of trust and blessing, then stepped back to take his seat. The ceremony began, the familiar words of the marriage service taking on new meaning, as Adrian spoke his vows with absolute conviction, promising to love and cherish Eleanor for all the days of their lives. When it came time for Eleanor to speak her vows, her voice was clear and steady despite the tears streaming down her cheeks. She promised to love him in sickness and in health, in joy and in sorrow, forsaking all others as long as they both should live. And as she spoke those words, Adrian knew with absolute certainty that he was the most fortunate man who had ever lived. The vicar pronounced them husband and wife, and Adrian kissed his Duchess for the first time as her husband, pouring every ounce of love and joy and gratitude into that kiss. The small congregation erupted in applause and cheers, but Adrian barely heard them. There was only Eleanor, her hand in his, her smile lighting up the world, her love surrounding him like the warmth of the sun. The wedding breakfast that followed was a joyful affair, filled with laughter and toasts, and the kind of genuine celebration that comes when people truly care about the happiness being celebrated. Marcus gave a speech that was both funny and touching, referencing their friendship and the years he had watched Adrian pine silently for Eleanor. Isabel spoke about her joy at gaining Eleanor as a sister, about how she had known from the first that they belonged together. Lord Hargrave offered his own toast, speaking of his initial resistance to the match, his concern about scandal, and his eventual recognition that his daughter's happiness mattered more than any social consideration. "I give you my daughter," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Not because Adrian is a duke, not because of rank or title or social position, but because he loves her as she deserves to be loved. And that, in the end, is all any father can hope for." As the celebration continued into the evening, Adrian and Eleanor slipped away to walk in the gardens of Ravenshire Manor, the estate that would now be Eleanor's home as well as his. They walked hand in hand through the rose gardens, past the conservatory where they had shared their first honest conversation, beneath the ancient yew where he had proposed. The setting sun painted everything in shades of gold, and Eleanor's face glowed with happiness that made her more beautiful than ever. "Are you happy?" Adrian asked, the question that had meant so much throughout their journey, finally asked without fear or reservation. "More than I ever imagined possible," Eleanor said, stopping to face him, her hands finding his. "When I was engaged to Sutcliffe, when I thought I had to resign myself to a loveless marriage, I couldn't imagine feeling this way. I couldn't imagine waking up excited about my future, looking forward to each day, feeling truly seen and valued and loved." "You deserve all of it," Adrian said, pulling her close. "You deserve every happiness, every joy, every dream fulfilled. And I intend to spend the rest of my life making sure you have it." "We'll face challenges," Eleanor said realistically, her practical nature asserting itself even in this moment of pure joy. "Society will always have opinions. There will be difficulties and obstacles we can't foresee. Marriage isn't always easy, even when it's built on love." "Then we'll face those challenges together," Adrian said simply. "We'll weather every storm side by side, support each other through every difficulty. That's what marriage means. Not perfection, but partnership. Not the absence of problems, but the commitment to solve them together." Eleanor smiled, that radiant expression that never failed to make his heart race. "When did you become so wise?" "When I fell in love with you," he said honestly. "You taught me what really matters, Eleanor. Not duty for its own sake, not propriety without purpose, not social position without substance. You taught me about courage and authenticity and the importance of fighting for what truly matters." They stood together as the sun set completely and the first stars began to appear in the darkening sky, two people who had found their way to each other despite all the obstacles society and circumstance had placed in their path. The journey hadn't been easy, but standing there in the twilight with Eleanor in his arms, Adrian knew that every moment of suffering had been worth it to reach this perfect joy. In the years that followed, their marriage blossomed and deepened in ways that exceeded even their highest hopes. They faced challenges, of course. Society always found new ways to test and judge, and the responsibilities of managing a ducal estate brought their own pressures and complications. But they met each obstacle together, their love providing strength and support through every difficulty. Eleanor became a duchess unlike any London society had seen before. She refused to simply play the role of ornamental wife, instead using her position and intelligence to make real contributions. She became involved in charitable works, particularly focused on education for girls from less privileged backgrounds. She hosted salons where political ideas were discussed alongside literature and art, creating spaces where women's voices were heard and valued. She brought warmth and genuine kindness to Ravenshire House, transforming it from a formal showcase into a true home. Adrian supported her in all of it, proud of her accomplishments and grateful for the way she used her influence for good. He had worried before their marriage that society would require her to diminish herself, to hide her intelligence and conform to narrow expectations of what a duchess should be. But Eleanor had never been one to accept limitations imposed by others, and with Adrian's support and encouragement, she created her own definition of what it meant to be Duchess of Ravenshire. Their household became famous for warmth, intelligence, and genuine hospitality. Guests remarked on the obvious affection between the Duke and Duchess, the way they looked at each other, even after years of marriage, the way they supported and championed each other in public and private. Young couples sought their advice about marriage, impressed by the genuine partnership they had created. Each Christmas they hosted the grandest ball in London, carrying on the tradition that had begun at Ashworth House. But the highlight of these celebrations was always the dance they shared together, watched in dreamy silence by every guest in attendance. Year after year, they took to the floor for that special waltz, moving together with the perfect synchronicity of two people who knew each other completely, who loved each other without reservation. And those who remembered that long-ago Christmas ball, when the Duke had danced with everyone except the woman he loved, now whispered a different story, a story of patience rewarded, of love conquering obstacles, of two people brave enough to fight for their happiness. Their love story became something of a legend in society, proof that genuine love could exist even in a world often dominated by arrangement and social calculation. Young women pointed to Eleanor as proof that they didn't have to settle for loveless marriages, that happiness was possible even when it seemed impossible. Young men looked at Adrian and learned that true strength lay in vulnerability, that admitting love was courage rather than weakness. And through it all, through every Christmas ball and every ordinary day, through challenges faced and joys celebrated, Adrian and Eleanor held fast to the promises they had made to each other. They treasured every moment, never taking their happiness for granted, always remembering how close they had come to losing each other. They built a life based not on duty or obligation, but on genuine love and partnership and the courage to be authentically themselves. As the years passed and their hair began to silver, as they watched Isabel marry and start her own family, as they became respected elders of London society, Adrian and Eleanor never forgot that winter night when everything had changed. They never forgot the conservatory conversation that had transformed their lives, the courage it had taken to break an engagement and defy society's expectations, the leap of faith required to believe that love could overcome every obstacle. And so, dear listeners, their story reminds us that true love, brave, honest, patient love can change not only individual lives, but the very world those lives inhabit. Eleanor and Adrian's courage in claiming their happiness, their refusal to settle for less than genuine love, their willingness to face scandal, and society's judgment for the chance at real joy. These choices rippled outward, touching everyone who knew them, changing the conversation about what marriage could and should be. Their story teaches us that sometimes the greatest act of courage is not in grand gestures or dramatic confrontations, but in the simple honesty of saying, "I love you," to the person who holds your heart. It reminds us that happiness is worth fighting for, that love is worth the risk of rejection, that authenticity matters more than society's approval. If their story has touched your heart, if you felt the longing in that first dance and the joy in their eventual union, if you've been moved by their courage and inspired by their love, we would be honored if you would subscribe to hear more tales like this. Please leave a comment sharing your thoughts. Which moment touched you most? What would you have done in Eleanor's position? Your reflections and engagement mean the world to us and help us bring more stories of courage, love, and triumph to life. And don't forget to hit that like button if this story resonated with you, and activate those notifications so you never miss when we share new tales of love conquering all obstacles, of brave hearts claiming their happiness, of two souls finding their way to each other despite everything that stands between them. Your support allows us to continue sharing these stories, to keep alive the belief that love, real, genuine, courageous love, is always worth fighting for. So until we meet again, may you have the courage to love honestly, the strength to fight for your happiness, and the wisdom to recognize when you've found something worth treasuring. And may every ball you attend bring you as much magic as the one where a duke finally danced with the only woman his heart had ever claimed. Fasir.